Should ask me in a moment. All right, there we go. I just approved.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We actually have a man who can read and write to interview. A phenomenal, unbelievable, incredible, unusual man. I mean, it's not saying much, but he can actually read and write. These days, maybe that's a big compliment. And Alex Newman, I've known him for a number of years. He is in the dictionary under erudition, they have his picture, along with wanted pictures in the post office from the federal government. Just kidding. And Alex has written a tremendous amount documenting the loss of our freedoms in America and elsewhere. He has written some incredible books, done incredible interviews, traveled all over the world, educated all over the world. His book that he wrote along with an old friend of mine named Sam Blumenfeld was called The Crimes of the Educators. Literally, The Crimes of the Educators. And that was a fantastic book. And now he's followed it up with a book called, which I have right here, called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. And it's a spiritual death, and in some cases, a physical death. And parents better wake up. I tell the truth, whether you like it or not. And if you're allowing your kids to be subject to this, then you certainly don't deserve them. I can't take them away because they're your God-given right, but you're certainly not doing a very good job. And this book takes, in a very simple way, he simplified it because these are complicated issues. This book will take you through a plethora from the beginning to the end. Some of the chapters in the book cover it all. He starts off with giving you the background of the government schools, what they were for. And then from there, he goes on the weaponization of the schools to turn your kids into godless socialists. And he ties in the UN, he ties in all of these international organizations, and also the data they're keeping on your kids. And I've got to tell you, frankly, if you let your kids go to a public school, you are out of your mind and you're also a moron. Sorry, but that's the truth. So Alex, let's start from the beginning. Your book goes to the genesis, pardon the word, but you're not allowed to mention anything that's godly. It's a crime. But the genesis or the beginnings of the public school system, the government school system. Give us a little background on what the purpose was and these characters that were the founders.
Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you for the kind words. And that's one of the main objectives of the book is to show people that the men who built this system that we call the public school system today, I call it the government indoctrination camps masquerading as a school system, they always intended to do what the schools are doing today. They always planned to turn children away from God. They always planned to turn children away from their parents and from their families. They always planned to undermine the values that created the United States of America. And they always intended, and they said so, to fundamentally transform the United States of America from what they consider to be an individualistic Christian nation toward a utopian communistic nation. Now, they had differences somewhat in their worldviews, right? Robert Owen, who first came up with the idea that children ought to be educated by government, was a utopian. He believed in socialism. He wanted to get rid of private property. He wanted to dismantle the family. His stupid communist commune in Indiana failed within 2 years, and he concluded that the reason why was that the government hadn't educated these children. They had been educated by their parents in individualistic and Christian ways with the Bible, and he wanted to dispense with that. So that system actually, based on Robert Owen's essays, got picked up in Prussia. The Prussian dictatorship there that was still smarting from losing a war with Napoleon decided to implement the very first ever that we can find system of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. And, it wasn't too many generations before they're goose stepping around and putting their neighbors in concentration camps and things. We know how that experiment in government education went over a long enough timeline. Well, that system was then imported back to the United States of America by Horace Mann. Before we get to Horace Mann, I should say something about Robert Owen. Now, Robert Owen, after the failure of his silly, goofy commune, New Harmony in Indiana, he realized his ideas on government education were not popular. Parents were educating their own children. If they needed help, they'd go to the church, right? Why in the world would we want the government to be involved in educating our children? So he created what a whistleblower, the whistleblower became a Catholic and repented of his involvement in this monstrous plan. And he described Robert Owen's operation as a secret society modeled on the Carbonari of Italy, of Europe. And he said that the twin goals of this secret society were to shift public opinion, to shape the minds of people to believe that the government ought to play a role in educating their children, and also to get men elected to legislatures. Only men could be elected back then. Men elected to legislatures who would support their purposes, government role for education. Well, again, that was not a popular idea. But then Orsis Brownson, the whistleblower who became a Catholic and blew the whistle on all this, said that the ultimate objective, and this is almost word for word quote, the ultimate objective was to get rid of Christianity. And he said we were going to do that not by openly attacking Christianity in the schools, but by first just focusing only on the things that can be perceived by the natural senses, and then eventually, where we can, bring the clergy into a state of ridicule, right? So people would kind of mock them and laugh them. So that was his plan. Horace Mann ended up building a replica of that system that had taken root in Prussia in Massachusetts. He also rejected the Bible. He had a very, in my opinion, flawed view on the nature of man because he rejected the principles that the Bible teaches about human nature. And he wanted to equalize all men. He believed that if we had government schools, we'd get rid of 90% of the crimes that were taking place in society. Of course, exactly the opposite happened. Then after he was done doing his magic in Massachusetts, he traveled around the country like a traveling evangelist, preaching the good news of salvation by government indoctrination. And little by little, other states started joining the bandwagon. They'd set up government schools. Pretty soon, by the early 1900s, they started almost all of them passing compulsory attendance laws. And it wasn't like today. You didn't have to spend 9 months in a brainwash camp. But, when you're not harvesting crops with your family, why don't you come and learn some stuff? Of course, the Bible was still the main textbook. They couldn't just get rid of it like that. It would have been, for them, an oxymoron to have education without the Bible. But gradually, they kept moving this process along. And then along comes John Dewey, the founding father of the public education system. Now, here's a guy who we know so much about what he believed. He went to the Soviet Union and wrote these crazy essays. You almost cannot believe you're reading this. Talk about what a glorious experiment it is, how great it is that the indoctrination camps are instilling a collectivistic mentality in the minds of these precious little children. And it gets so extreme. So one area where Dewey differed with the Bolsheviks was the Bolsheviks believed in armed revolution, and so did the Marxists. Dewey believed that a gradual approach would be more effective in making this a permanent thing. But they both ultimately believed in this idea of a new Soviet man and that brainwashing kids could bring that about. So John Dewey also started a new religion. People don't realize this. It's very much communism disguised as a false religion, but they wrote it down, right? So we know what their religion was about. It was called the Humanist Manifesto. And in the Humanist Manifesto, the very first words, the very first tenet is, we religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. In other words, Genesis 1:1, where God says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that's garbage. We don't believe that. The universe is self-existing and not created. That also means, by extension, Bob, that the principles our country was founded on, that it's a self-evident truth that God created us, that he gave us rights, that the government should protect these rights. That's all silliness. That's all garbage. Now, John Dewey wanted this false religion from hell taught in the public schools. But of course, he couldn't just say, hey, Christian nation, we're going to brainwash your kids to believe that the universe is self-existing and not created. So it's a gradual approach of dumbing down the population. And we've got the quotes where he's really outlining a plan to dumb down the American people. He teams up, and this is really interesting, and a lot of people are going to think it's counterintuitive, and it is in a way. He teamed up with the Rockefeller dynasty, right? One of the wealthiest families ever in human history, maybe the wealthiest. Possibly some exceptions there. And they teamed up. You got a communist and a super capitalist teaming up to build what they described as an experimental school at the University of Chicago. Rockefeller gave Dewey $3.1 million through the General Education Board, one of their philanthropies. And they set up this school. And to his credit, Rockefeller actually put some of his kids in there. So, he must have somewhat believed in this nonsense. And so a bunch of kids graduate from this program. They can't read. Right? And Nelson Rockefeller actually talked about this. There are some of the
Right,
Rockefellers who admitted they can't
right.
read. So they couldn't read. They couldn't tell right from wrong. They couldn't write. They couldn't do anything. And Dewey and Rockefeller thought this will be perfect. So they set about to do this across the United States. Dewey ended up over at Teachers College at Columbia University, helped bring in the Frankfurt School so that they could distribute themselves through academia with funding from the Rockefellers. And then in 1962, 1963, this false religion of John Dewey's, he said, we got to get rid of the profit motive. We need to reorganize the means of production so that we have collective ownership. This is all in his religious manifesto. That became the established religion of the United States through a outrageous ruling from the Supreme Court. So in 1962, they said no more prayer. And this was not even a sectarian prayer in New York, right? It was a Jewish rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister had come together. They'd come up with a prayer that everybody could live with. And that's what they were asking the children to say at school. So the Supreme Court said, no, you can't have prayer. Then the next year in 1963, they ruled you couldn't have the Bible. And the guy who wrote the dissent in this case, Justice Potter Stewart, hit the nail on the head. He said, what happened here is not the realization of a state of neutrality with respect to religion. What happened here is actually the establishment of a religion of secularism, which is, of course, exactly what John Dewey would have recognized as humanism. So they established a national religion under the guise of the First Amendment, which says Congress should not pass any law respecting an establishment of religion. I don't know how they managed to convince dumbed down Americans of that, but I assume the dumbing down process was important. And then from there, they started indoctrinating children with this false religion, and now we see the fruit of it, right? The kids are chopping off their private parts, they're shooting each other, they're committing suicide, they're taking heroin, smoking crack, stabbing each other in the bathroom, and we say, whoa, why is this happening? We need more mental health counseling, we need more gun control. No, we need less dumbed down, diabolical indoctrination in the schools. So that's kind of the history
And
compressed into a soundbite.
correct me if I'm wrong. Rhetorical question. John Dewey was not a Jew,
He was not, no.
and
He came from a Christian family, but he was
Rockefeller.
Rockefeller was a self-proclaimed Methodist. By their fruit and by their deeds ye shall know them. So questionable, but no, they were not Jews.
So all the anti-Semites out there that are saying this is all a Jewish conspiracy,
They're
I
wrong.
guess they're wrong.
They are wrong. And it's very unfortunate when people get obsessed with that, and then they start coming up with silly excuses like, well, he was a crypto Jew, he was a secret Jew, and it gets very ridiculous. Certainly there are people who have called themselves Jews who have participated in some of these evil schemes, but there are also people who call themselves Catholic and Methodist and Hindus and Muslim, and so the idea that this is all just one big giant Jewish conspiracy, I think, really misses the point. And anti-Semites really have to bend themselves into pretzels to try to make everybody seem like a secret Jew. It gets really ridiculous after a point, but
Okay, so now we know what the genesis or the inception of the public school system, and wasn't it also modeled on the Prussian system where they used it to mold little sheep to just follow whatever the state would say, and it became a very effective measurement and a very effective technique
it
to
was.
meet their goals. And
Yep.
in fact, I think it was Robert Stitched, I believe, in the Clinton administration, who said, we don't want highly literate people, we want manageable workers. Manageable, as in a sheep is very manageable. All you need is a collie, and the collie nips at their heels, and the sheep all go in their little sheep circle, and then they put on masks and they stick needles in their arms and socialist distance from each other, and you got the whole ball of wax in one fell swoop. Now, one of the ways, one of the ways that they monitor the success or failure of their program, and when I say success, to them, what success is actually failure, because they want the kids to fail in terms of literacy and knowledge. But there's a lot of information about the fact that the government, especially now with technology, is monitoring these kids based on their attitudes and their emotions and There, of course, was a famous book by Anita Hogue called Beverly Aikman, rather, Educating for the New World Order. Tell us a little bit about that and how they monitor every one of your kids if they're in a public school.
Yeah, well, let's start with the Prussian issue because that's a really significant component of this that is really not well known. In fact, very, very few people, even experts on education systems, don't understand this. So Robert Owen wrote all these essays. One of the big ones was called On the Formation of Human Character. This is 1813, I believe. And he argued that the best government would be the one that had the best system of national, in other words, government education. And so these ideas did not take root in the United States. But what happened, according to Robert Owen, it's very hard to find documentation on this. There's not a lot written about it. But according to Robert Owen in his autobiography, the ambassador to Prussia got copies of these essays, took them back to the dictator of Prussia, and according to Robert Owen, again, right now all I've been able to find with help from Sam Blumenfeld is Robert Owen's own testimony on this. But he says that the Prussian dictator so much approved of these ideas that he ordered his interior minister to implement them, to create a national system of education in Prussia, not for the purpose of educating children, not for the purpose of teaching them to seek out truth or to learn about God or anything useful, rather to create dumbed down, obedient soldiers and workers who would do what they're told by the people above them in the hierarchy. So that is really the genesis of the Prussian system, which then Horace Mann re-imported into the United States. So the Prussian system is actually, through Robert Owen and Horace Mann, intimately intertwined with the American system. We still have a variation of the Prussian model, which was really the Robert Owen model in the United States today. Now they've tweaked it, they've changed it, et cetera, but it was all on that foundation. It's very important. Now you asked about the data mining and the collection of information. What they are doing right now, Bob, is unprecedented in the history of humanity. Every child in every government indoctrination camp, and many now in private schools, many now in home schools that are taking government money, that are getting ensnared in the system, are being tracked in more ways than you can count. The government actually brags that they're collecting hundreds of data points on every single child. So how does daddy talk to mommy? What kind of food do you have in your refrigerator? Does anybody at your house smoke? How much drinking is going on? What kind of beliefs do you have? What is your attitude to perversion, right? They ask the kids on these surveys, how many sex partners have you had in the last year? 15, 25, 30, or more than 100, right? So these little 11-year-old kids like, whoa, is that normal? So they're gathering all this data. They're examining their teeth, checking out their dental health. They're doing mental health screenings, checking on their mental health. They're feeding them breakfast, lunch, and dinner and collecting data on that. And now we have something called social emotional learning, which is so nefarious. We could do 10 episodes just on this. But what they're doing with SEL, and they say this pretty openly, right? The goal of SEL is not an academic objective. It's not like the student should be able to read at a third grade level, but it is the student should have XYZ attitude or feeling or emotion. So let's just say they want to normalize the mass murder of unborn babies that they call abortion. So they'll set as the goal that these children need to be empathetic. And then they'll give them situations, well, this poor girl, she was young, she had sex, the condom broke, and now she's pregnant. Poor thing, her life is ruined. The empathetic thing here is to A, force her under penalty of law to carry that baby to term, or B, allow her to just terminate the pregnancy and remove the tissue from her uterus. And if you get the wrong answer, if you say, well, of course we shouldn't be murdering that baby, you're doing it on your device, right? And you get a sad face, redo. And so the system is gathering all of these insights onto your child's views and beliefs. They're using it, first of all, through an algorithm and now increasingly through artificial intelligence to then come back and stage an intervention. So they'll try again. How do we get this child to support abortion and to see it as the empathetic thing to allow? And so all this data is being sucked in, and they're very proud of this. I've got a report from the U.S. Department of Education from 2012 that brags about these things. They've got facial expression cameras, they say, that will, and this was in place 10 years ago, that will monitor the facial expressions of a child in response to a stimulus, and then pump that data through the algorithm, determine what their reaction was, and determine whether we need to intervene to get them to the right attitude. And then they say in this 2012 report, they're going to use all of this data, in their words, to make predictions about the future values, behaviors, skills, and performance of these children. So this is an Orwellian thing beyond anything Orwell could have imagined in his darkest nightmares. and we are rushing headlong into it without people even realizing what's happening. It's all funded by the federal government. The United Nations is intimately involved in this process. 2019, they had the first AI in Education conference in Beijing. So, folks, it's coming. It's happening. If your children are in the system in any way, this includes in a private school with a government subsidy, they are vacuuming up more data than you could ever imagine. Very soon, they will know your children better than you know them.
Well, that's for sure. I remember in Anita Hoag's book, her book is I'm sorry, Beverly Aikman's book about Anita Hoag. Anita Hoag's son came down after taking the one of these assessment tests at a public school, and he was in a very disruptive, disturbed mood. And she began to ask him questions about why he was so upset. And he began to talk about the questions he faced on that standardized exam. For example, one that I remember from so many years ago is they asked a hypothetical about his friends taking rocks and breaking windows, throwing the rocks through the windows of a home. And the question was, under what circumstances would you join your friends? And it didn't leave him with any choice answer to say, no, I wouldn't throw rocks through somebody's window at all. They did not let the kid have an escape. And I remember reading about what they call locus of control. What is it about the way this kid works that will get him to break, just the way in the Soviet prison camps or in the Chinese or Vietnamese prison camps, they would find out a weakness in the person, his locus of control, and use that to get him to snap, whether it's his family or his kids or whatever it is, or his patriotism. And this technique has been used by totalitarians from time immemorial. And the other aspect that I want to ask you about, which you've written about extensively, is the fact that people who cannot be autodidacts, in other words, be self-educated and read on their own, they are going to be subject to whatever they're fed, whether it's from these teachers or from the government or from the media or from the despicable culture with Taylor Swift, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're dumbed down and you can't seek out information independently, you're finished. They've got you. So let's talk about how they were able to take the most literate nation, probably in human history. The only ones I could compare to what America was in the 1700s would be the old ancient rabbis like Maimonides and people of that stature intellectually. Other than that, there is nothing that compares to the founders and their kids and grandkids. So how were they able to take that nation with these highly literate, independent thinkers and turn them into a bunch of drones that are running around in the universities attacking anyone who dares to say anything against the establishment propaganda?
The answer, in short, is the government education system. And you're right. I think it's worthwhile talking a little bit about the education that used to exist in America prior to government schools. People don't realize government schools are a very recent innovation. Prior to the mid 1800s, government schools were not a thing in America. Government did not run schools. Government did not educate children. It was primarily a family affair. Mom, dad, aunts, uncles, grandma, grandpa, older siblings, right? In James Madison's case, he was helping his older siblings learn how to do basic things like read, write. And then if they needed outside assistance, they'd send them to a church school. They'd hire a tutor to come by. And then once they were 14, 15, 16, maybe they'd go off to a great religious university like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, pretty much all the good ones that you can think of that at one time were actually Christian institutions. So what happened was they knew they couldn't do it quickly. In fact, we quote John Dewey, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I, in an essay he wrote in 1898. It's called The Primary Education Fetish, where he argues against teaching kids how to read and write and that stuff. What they really need is collectivism. says the changes must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So they knew if they went too quick, they'd probably be tarred and feathered. So let's talk real quick about the education that existed. Actually, the entire afterword of this book, which is probably the longest section, the most significant section, takes a look at education through the ages, the education that the founding generation would have received, what the Bible teaches, Old and New Testament teaches on education, and compares that and contrasts that with what we have today. So back then, education again was primarily home education. Almost everybody knew how to read. We've got actual data on this. In 1812, I believe it was, DuPont de Nemours had done a study, a literacy study on the United States. What he found is that not more than 4 in 1,000 young people were unable to write legibly, even neatly, is how he wrote it in the document. So almost we had cities like Boston, pretty much 100% literacy. This was unprecedented in human history, right? Where everybody can read, with the exception, of course, of slaves in the southern states. We had almost universal literacy. What was then considered, an 8th grade education was drastically superior to a PhD program or a master's program that we would have today. And the anecdotal evidence for this, in addition to all the data we have, is absolutely overwhelming. I encourage every American, go read the Federalist Papers. These were addressed to regular Americans. These were written for farmers and blacksmiths and shoemakers and shopkeepers, right? They were not addressed to PhDs from the elite universities. So how did we go from that to this? Well, the entire explanation is in this book. It started off gradually with the camel's nose under the tent, and it got worse and worse and worse with every passing generation. Horace Mann's establishment of state government-run schools in Massachusetts was probably the big start of all this based on the Prussian model. We talked about that. John Dewey, of course, weaponized the system even further. And then, of course, the federal government got majorly involved, starting in the 1960s with the Supreme Court rulings telling state and local governments what they could have or not have as far as Bibles and prayers go in the schools. And, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. But that was the goal all along, right? To remove the focus from God, remove the focus from academics, and change the focus to indoctrinating children to prepare for a new system where they would be hostile to family, hostile to private property. Now they've got very, very advanced psychological techniques. They took a lot of the Soviet sociological and psychological programs and experiments and applied them to education. Even Pavlov's dogs, right? People think that doesn't have relevance for today. That's what they're doing to your children in school. They're conditioning them to have certain emotional responses to certain triggers. So when they hear Trump, or when they hear border, or when they hear Republican, or when they hear Christianity or Judaism, they start salivating, right? I'm not literally, but they have this visceral emotional response that is uncontrollable. They didn't reason themselves into these positions. They were conditioned, just like a circus animal would be, to have a certain response to a given stimulus.
Yesterday, a mother told me that her grandson sneezed in the house, and she said, "God bless you." And the daughter-in-law said to her, "You are not allowed to use that word in our house." Talk about a Pavlovian dog. It's an insult to dogs.
Right. It's so shameful what they are doing, Bob. And unfortunately, if you look at the data now, we are unbelievably dumbed down. Again, the federal government does every 2 years a national assessment of educational progress, they call it, where they do they take a representative sample of victims of government schools and give them academic tests. And their own data, their latest data shows that less than 1/3 of the victims of these institutions are proficient in anything. And by proficient, I don't mean like they're good at it. I don't mean they're massive. It means they're barely eking by over the most dumbed down standards you could possibly imagine. So, if you're proficient in reading in 4th grade, it doesn't even mean you can read, right? It means you've memorized a handful of words and you can kind of decipher what's on a page if you have pictures of Spot and the ball. But this is where we're at now as Americans, as a nation. And if you look at where we came from, the decline is almost hard to even believe. It is so significant. One of the data points that I use is the presidential speeches, right? In the 1800s, it's up here in terms of complexity, the length of words, the length of time, the complexity of ideas. Then you look at the year 2000, and it's down here, right? It's like at a 1st grade level. You have Kamala Harris, Russia big, Ukraine small, and everybody like, oh yeah, ooh, train like trained seals. It's just horrific what they have done to us, Bob. And the entire explanation for how this happened is found in this book. It was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. If you don't understand that it was deliberate, you don't understand the problem. And like a doctor who doesn't have an accurate diagnosis, if you don't have an accurate diagnosis, you're not going to successfully be able to treat the patient. In this case, this is a deadly disease. It will kill our country. And if we don't get serious about treating it and curing it, it's all over, folks. All these issues that we're fighting on, you're trying to get the border secure, you're trying to reduce taxes, trying to control the national debt, trying to preserve gun rights, free speech, whatever. All that is gone if we don't deal with this.
I recently called the corporate headquarters of my bank to get information. So some woman comes on the phone, and she's supposed to be the person in charge of this information. So she says to me, I first need to read to you a disclaimer. I said, okay, go ahead and read it. She goes, Mr. Unger, U-N-G-E-R is Unger. And she began to fumfer. This is the person whose job it is to read the disclaimer, and she can't read the disclaimer. And anytime she was trying to read a word that had similar letters to another word, she displaced the word that was actually there for something else. And I remember when my son was 5 years old, I originally taught him how to read at home, and then I made the moronic mistake of putting him in the public school, although it didn't last long. And I confronted the principal with the failure to teach proper reading methodology and spelling, etc. The principal said, it doesn't matter if a child substitutes the word house for home or jet for airplane, because those words are exactly the same in their meaning. And I said, really? You mean Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz said, there's no place like house? There's no place. Or maybe the song is House, House on the Range, where the deer and the antelope roam. And then I said to her, I hope you go in for a splenectomy and the doctor uses your methodology and removes your spine instead of your spleen. And that's literally what's happening sometimes.
Yep, it really is. And, we actually get into great depth on that. Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I did in the book Crimes of the Educators. When you realize some of the madness spouted by the so-called education establishment, you almost can't believe that it's real. You have some of them who say teaching children phonics is part of a right-wing conspiracy. Yeah, we're conspiring to make your children literate. Can you imagine the horror, right? So this is the kind of stuff they have what they call word attack skills. So they teach the kids to memorize a bunch of words. You get your flashcards and you memorize a bunch of words as if the words were Chinese. And then when you come to a word that you don't know, then they teach you to use your word attack skills to try to decipher it. And so they give you what are the contexts, what pictures are on the page that might help you decipher, rather than just sound out the dumb word, right? The F stands for a f sound, the A stands for a sound. Right? So this is the kind of idiocy that these PhDs in education and reading and literacy are pumping out at taxpayer expense, and they're pumping it, of course, into the minds of your children, which are rapidly becoming mush.
Well, speaking of PhDs, my wife is a PhD in a real subject, medical science, and from Columbia, and she also has a postdoctorate. And she was called on the carpet yesterday for being faith-based and not following the science, because she simply told the students yesterday that there are people who are very well researched who say that evolution is a bunch of nonsense. But she said further, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you to think and to explore the fact that there are other viewpoints on this, and they are not in agreement with the textbook and the establishment. And the same is true of so-called climate change. There are people from MIT who have written debunking articles about climate change being a fraud. But once again, she didn't tell them it's a fraud. And then she also made a remark about masks. Ooh, now that's a crime. Apparently, 3 parents wrote to the principal saying she's only faith-based. She's not, quote unquote, following the Fauci, following the science. Okay?
Insane.
True story.
Absolutely insane. I believe it. Our whole society has lost its mind, Bob, as you know. And this kind of idiocy, thanks to now 4, in some cases 5 generations of government schools, this idiocy is becoming the norm. I mean, I'm kind of insulated from it because I don't work in a corporate office or a government building. But everywhere you go now, you got the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. You got the Marxist struggle sessions. You've got things that are so idiotic that no sensible person even 5 years ago would have bought into it. This idea that gender is a social construct and men ought to go shower with little girls. I mean, this stuff is so insane that even a few years ago it wouldn't have nobody would have even believed it was possible. Now it's ubiquitous. So again, it all goes back to what we exposed in here. If we don't understand this, we will never stop it. And I love the people who are running for school board and stuff. God bless you for trying to do something. But the reality is, they want to save the system. They want to reform the system. And I tell people, it's like, how do you want to reform your cancer? How would you like to fix your cancer? Well, we don't want to reform our cancer. We don't want to tweak the cancer. We want to eliminate the cancer because it's going to kill the patient if we don't deal with it. You don't want to reform something that has been built for the purpose of dumbing down, indoctrinating, and sexualizing your children. You want to destroy that thing and allow something far better, a free market system in education led by parents, led by religious institutions, led by nonprofits to emerge in place of where this abomination once was.
Well, I can anticipate what a lot of people are going to say, so I'm going to lead this into the culmination of the interview. First of all, we're talking to Alex Newman. His book is called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, spiritual death, and unfortunately brain death as well. And who knows, with what they're teaching, it could lead to even worse things. And certainly the first solution for those who can actually read, which is a diminishing population, read this book. And it's okay, Alex won't be offended. Take the yellow marker and underline every important thing. And you can even put little ears on the pages so you can go back and understand what is here so you can save your kids, unless you don't think that's important. So, Alex, other than reading your book, which is the first step, what would you say is the solution to this horrible problem?
Well, that's one of the greatest things about this problem, Bob. A lot of the problems that we're facing, there is no simple solution. There is no easy way to protect yourself and your family. What can we do about the national debt? Well, not much, right? We can run for Congress, we can write our congressman, but those things just like, practically ineffective. The great thing about this problem is you can protect your children right this moment. Depending on what state you live in, call up the superintendent of your county, send a letter to whatever Department of Education you have to send. Say, I am withdrawing my child from your ridiculous brainwash camp. They're going to be home educated. They're going to be placed in a Christian school, a Jewish school, a pagan school, if you want, right? I mean, whatever you think you need to do, but get them out of the government system. So that's an incredibly simple solution. Now, that won't solve the overall problem that we still have over 75% of the children in this country being brainwashed, but everyone who is removed from there is another major dent to the system. And really the solution is a mass exodus from this horrific system. And it's already happening, Bob. 10 years ago when I went on Phyllis Schlafly's show and said, we got to get our kids out. People were like, that's a lot easier said than done. Well, today it's happening, right? 3 times before he died, Rush Limbaugh said, parents, get your kids out of these schools. They're being turned into Marxists. Get your kids out. Franklin Graham, the most prominent evangelical leader in the world today, said, hey, I'd pull my kids out of public school. I'd put them in a Christian school. So the tide is turning. Millions of kids are fleeing the system. Millions of families are fleeing the system. And that's what we need to do. Every time a child leaves, their budget gets reduced. And that's another child who's going to be well educated, at least potentially. And really, you don't need a majority. People say, well, we have to get 51% of the kids. No, we don't, right? Think about Gideon and with 300 men, how God defeated this massive enemy army. Think about the little boy that pointed out that the emperor had no clothes. It was just one boy who hadn't succumbed to the fear and the propaganda. He said, hey, the emperor's naked. And then everybody else said, oh, yeah, he is naked. Are we allowed to say that? Oh, well, I guess he is. So, every kid that leaves the system is a tremendous benefit, not just for your family, not just for your community, but for the country, for your church, for your synagogue, for your community, and ultimately for humanity itself. And then after that, I do believe after you've got your children safely out, we do have an obligation, right? If the children are in a burning building, you rescue your children, but you wake the town. You say, guys, your children are also in the burning building. You might want to think about getting them out of there because they're being destroyed mentally, physically, morally, spiritually, academically, and in every possible way. You might want to consider getting them out of there. And the more people flee, the more this is going to become very obvious to people that everybody ought to get out. Let the old system collapse, and let's go back to a free market, right? The parents are ultimately in charge. To the extent that they need assistance, they go to a nonprofit, they go to their church, they go to their synagogue, they go to their neighbors, they create a homeschool co-op or community. The free market is an amazing thing. And I do want to say to teachers, not anti-teacher, right? I had the fake news propaganda outlet, I forget if it was owned by New York Times or Washington Compost up in Washington in Spokane. They say, Alex accuses teachers of treason after my speech there. I didn't accuse the teachers of treason. Okay, they ran a correction the next day. But the reality is, it's just like with the Soviet collective farms, right? Nobody would say you're anti-farmer for saying that a collective farm is an idiotic idea that is not going to work to feed the population. So we're not anti-teacher. We still will need teachers in a free market. They just won't be controlled by a wicked system from the pit of hell that is destroying children. So that's the solution. Start with getting your kids out. Get other people in your family, in your community, your neighbors, your church, your synagogue to pull their kids out. Start alternatives, and we can do it. We are doing it, and we must continue doing it. And without trying to sound alarmist, everything depends on the outcome of this battle.
Well, when I talk to people, what the feedback usually is you're so negative. And I say, yes, if Paul Revere was riding through your town saying the British are coming, you'd come out, look out the window and yell down, why are you being so negative? On the other hand, I'd be grabbing my musket. And that's the difference. So folks out there, before you grab your musket, read this book and learn something so you won't need the musket. Alex,
Absolutely.
as always, God bless, and we'll talk soon. Everybody get this book, Indoctrinating Your Children to Death.
God
Read
bless
it.
you too. Thank you, Bob.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.